apologize in advance for any imprecisions you may see or feel that come with brevity. But let's get started. What do police budgets have to do with climate mobilization? First, I want to start off with how we define climate mobilization. We define it as a whole of society effort to move rapidly and urgently to adapt our social and economic systems to fully decarbonize and move towards a more just and democratic society. Now, when we're talking about that transformation to adapt, budgets are society's statements of moral priorities. And currently, our budgets at state, federal, and municipal levels in all of America do not sufficiently reflect the urgency of climate emergency. Rather, they reflect the legacy of America's white supremacist history and the priority of profits over the people. What we want to bring about is a just transition, which demands investments to frontline and BIPOC communities from the entities most responsible for bringing about the climate crisis, especially when it comes to the financial burdens of decarbonization. With these three premises in mind, the conclusion is inescapable that reallocating money from our current priorities is necessary to effectively and collectively, as a public entity, put our money where our mouth is and mobilize society against climate change and towards climate justice. And to be clear, this Invest, Divest framework is sourced from the Movement for Black Lives. There'll be a number of links in this presentation. We'd be happy to make those slides and those links available to any observers. So what do we mean by a just transition? A set of principles, policies, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative, sustainable economy. Now, I want to break down that a little bit further here. When we think of like extractive policies, practices, and philosophies, a lot of the extractive, those things that fall into that category are the things that align with policing. You see incarceration, which is extracting humans from their communities and putting them in cages. You see civil asset forfeiture. On a per volume basis, more money is taken by police officers through civil asset forfeiture than all the burglaries every year combined. Property rights over people. The law, broadly speaking, has a lot more protections for property than for people. There are, constitutional protections for takings when those protections don't often extend to your right to health care, for example. And then treating the environment as a resource. There's much in the way of partnership between policing and extraction of from the environment, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But on the flip side, the regenerative practices and policies that we can think about, one of them is self-determination. And in a just transition, we believe communities get to self-determine their own needs. This is the democratic portion. Ecological restoration. We have to heal a damaged ecosystem from our human activities. Resiliency to a changing climate. We know that as things progress, even if we do succeed in our missions of decarbonization, there will be global weather chaos. And we have to adapt to that and change our 20th and 19th century systems to something that can survive. And equity. We meet communities where they are and we allocate resources so that all in every community can live happy and healthy lives. Let's talk a little bit more about the status quo investments towards extractive practices. From a strictly financial standpoint, policing, prisons, military, and the requisite courtroom expenses together comprise of massive status quo towards retributive extractive policy. We spend $995 million a day on policing in this country. The state of California, for example, spends $8.5 billion on prisons every year, which amounts to about $64,000 per inmate. The police misconduct settlements for New York City cost $1.7 billion over the last 10 years. To connect policing to military activities, I bring up the 1033 program, which is a program which enables local police departments to purchase military equipment from the Department of Defense. So when you see your MRAP rolling down your main streets, those are through the 1033 program. And then I also want to bring up the pandemic response as a statement of moral priority of society. In many spaces, we saw police budgets increase, while essential services, including EPA regulators, were cut during the emergency response. And a lot of those cuts still have not been restored. To go a little bit further on this, the military in America here gets 10 times more than the next 10 countries combined. Additionally, on a climate perspective, the military is the largest greenhouse gas emitting entity on the planet, which is why we cannot ignore it from this conversation. And that's even though we know it's probably underreporting emissions. On the other side of military missions is they've been excluded from a lot of the international agreements, which involve pacts with the global south largely about who owes who what for how many emissions. Now, if we look at the Build Back Better Act's expenditures over the next 10 years in comparison, or on an annual basis, excuse me, in comparison to the Pentagon budget, you can see from this graph, spending $778 billion on the Pentagon and only $37 billion per year on emissions mitigation. To add to this, BIPOC communities are the most polluted and the most policed communities in America. Not only are they the most polluted and policed, climate activists are frequently the targets of policing. And climate activists who happen to fall into BIPOC communities happen to receive some of the worst pushback against police for raising these concerns in their communities. We can see that in recent examples. We don't have to go to the distant past. Recent examples of Line 3 and Standing Rock, two pipeline projects through indigenous land this decade. There was much evidence of coordination between private oil companies, local police, national surveillance firms, and some other firms that contract with the Department of Defense. So there is this cohesive set of interests aligned against that of indigenous communities and towards climate action. Now, using the police to target political dissent targets the energy that drives climate movement. So if our job is to mobilize people on climate change, policing, as it is undertaken as currently, is promoting fear among those who are on the fence, whether or not to get involved. That is oppositional to our interests. But let's look at the other side. Where are the investments towards just transition so far? At every level, they look inadequate. The estimated cost to make every home in America run on renewable energy is about $40,000 per American. You'll notice that's about $24,000 less than we are spending per prison inmate in California. On a global perspective, I mentioned the COP26 in the Global South. Western nations at that conference promised $100 billion to the Global South. Has not been delivered. And it's important because those people in that part of the world generally have less emissions. And over the cumulative course of emissions for the last several hundred years, their contributions are completely dwarfed by countries like the United States. You can look at EV subsidies. EV subsidies are largely, at this point, still province of people with money and means. And within climate movements, you can see far more investments in some areas than in climate justice. The Nature Conservancy makes more in donations in a single week than all climate justice movements receive in 1 year. No matter where you're looking, we need more investment in these areas. And so to conclude here of my little piece before I open it up for some discussion and questions, is to point out that this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for coalition building, this conversation about budgets and priorities. And I think one space which really is great for building those coalitions is bringing in groups for participatory budgeting practices. You are bringing your community together to self-determine your collective destinies. And I think that is a lot of what we're trying to do here. But within that framework, we can also think about other equity-centered investments in climate that we can prioritize here. Climate emergency funds that focus on helping out BIPOC and other communities, low-income communities, decarbonize their homes or their cars or their ways to work. Climate Financing Authority can similarly provide that fund. Investments in resilience and adaptation are necessary for disasters. I think often of the levees in New Orleans and how they broke in Katrina. They actually held an Ida after billions of dollars were invested. Those are the types of things we are going to need at a much greater scale. And then finally, I mentioned fossil fuel risk bonds, which are another way to generate that extra investment, in addition to the defund and invest, divest conversation. And with that, I will open it up for questions and discussion. I think we have about 5 minutes. We got a question from Tiffany Boyd of what examples do you have of municipalities who are doing this well? I would say no single municipality is doing all these things well. There are some who are doing one or several things really well. I think that there's a lot of conversations in places like Austin about the role of their policing. But I will also say for alternatives, the STAR program here in Denver just got a federal expansion grant for its success in diverting a number of calls that would otherwise be sent to police instead to mental health workers. So that program was so successful in recent years that it's getting a federal boost, and they're trying to carry it elsewhere. And then the related question from Derek here about, are there any places where decision makers are seeing the connections between climate and policy? That's a great question. You do start to see it in largely BIPOC communities, and legislators who come from those communities, I think, is where I see it most frequently. I see this articulated frequently among Cori Bush, who has a lot of lived experience with policing. As well as on the climate justice criteria. And it does exist out there. I will say that there's a lot of work to be done in almost every part of the country. So we got a lot more work to do. Matt shared a great read on what's happening in Richmond, California on that as well. So I encourage people to check that out as well. And if there are no other questions, well, we got one from Chris Brown here. Local city council resistance to budget reform uses police contract as an a priori budget that cannot be cut without violating the contracts. It's a great point. So yes, sometimes that money is much more discretionary. Sometimes it is wrapped up into other things such as union agreements and things like that. To be honest, it's really a case-by-case basis when you're talking about local police budgets. Generally, though, there is always an option, and it's simply a matter of working through that process. But generally, it's just a question of how much work and what will it take, not whether or not it's possible. And with that, I think I will wrap up for time, and I will